Thank you, Vida. Really appreciate it. I'm really glad to be back here to be a part of this seminar. And I see that there's a huge age range today. Some of you are younger, some of you are older. So I'm going to try to make this talk as accessible as possible. And if at any point you feel that I'm not being accessible enough, feel free to interrupt me at any point. And if you have questions, please do the same. So I understand that most of you have been doing translation for the past few days, and today I'm going to talk about somebody that has a theory of translation or ideas about translation that I think you might find useful, and that person is Yan Fu. Now, before I start, I want to ask the audience, how many of you have heard of this person, Yan Fu, before? Anyone? Okay. Would somebody like to tell everybody a little bit about who Yan Fu is? Would you like to start? Oh, sorry.
So I don't know the detail about the Yan Fu, this person, but I think it's a scholar who really focus on the linguistics and also the translation.
Mm-hmm.
And we all know about that model of Xin Da Ya.
Okay.
So I think it means like a little bit of be honest to the origin text,
Mm-hmm.
and later on have different layers based on that,
Mm-hmm.
so on and so forth. I don't want to talk more about that. Yeah,
Oh, no. Thank you. What is your name?
Yeah, my name is Hansi Wang.
Hansi Wang.
Yeah, Hansi
Okay,
Wang.
thank you, Hansi. Would anybody like to add to that? Anybody else know more about Yan Fu that they want to add to just what Hansi has just said? Now, Hansi mentioned that Yan Fu is known for his remarks about Xin Da Ya. Okay, how many of you have heard of Xin Da Ya before? Okay, so I'm going to call on somebody in the back there. Can you tell us what Xin Da Ya means? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So to me, Xin is like be faithful to the original text, try to reflect the true meaning of it, and
Mm-hmm.
that is more like making the translation accessible and understandable to the audience.
Mm-hmm.
So like penetrating the meaning of the original text, also penetrating to the understanding of the audience, and is making the text elegant enough that it brings joy when people read it.
Okay, terrific. You guys are very knowledgeable. So xin is to be faithful to the original. Da is to make it understandable to the people who are reading it, the target audience. And then ya is to make the translation elegant. Now, I think the person next to you also raised his hand, right? So xin da ya. Do you agree with this, these three criteria of xin da ya? Do you think it makes sense? Is it useful when you're doing your own translation? What do you think?
I think it depends on the circumstance, because a lot of the times when we're doing translation, there are limitations when it comes to the audience. You know, for some people, they might not know who the audience is for, and for some other cases, you might not have the time to adjust to everything. And I think this is when we have to have certain circumstances, and I guess just trying to find the best way and the most efficient way, whether it be for translation or interpretation in general.
Do you think it would make sense to modify xin da ya in any way?
I think it's a more universal and general concept, and I think that as as like a foundation, it's pretty good as a foundation. But I think modifications, there could be modifications, but it would depend on the circumstance.
How would you modify it?
I think maybe specifying the importance of it. So I think the most important part is the first two, which is xing and da, because at the end of the day, when you're translating, you have to focus on bringing the information and allowing the people who you're translating for to be able to understand what you're translating. And then maybe elegancy is behind those two. Elegancy is something that you can strive for after you have already captured the meaning and you have already been able to, deliver what the original meaning of the text is.
Okay, terrific. So like a lot of other scholars, you believe that the first two, xin and da, are more important, and ya is kind of secondary. It's okay if you don't have ya. as long as you have xin and da. Now, anybody else want to add to that? Anybody else have different views about xin, da, and ya, now that it's clear to you what they mean? Okay, I thought that was a pretty good discussion to begin with. So with that, let me move on to my talk. Okay, so it seems like a lot of you are familiar with Yanfu. A lot of you have heard about xin da ya and know what xin da ya means. Okay, I'm gonna, well, kind of change the meaning of xin da ya a little bit later in my talk. And what I'd like to do today is, my talk will be divided into 4 parts. I'll talk briefly about Yanfu the person. So I'll talk about who he is, what he did, and then more importantly, what he wrote about xin da ya. Where do the terms xin da ya come from? What did he actually write? What did he actually say about these things? Okay, let's look at the original text. This is the background part. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the critical reception of xin da ya. Okay, a lot of scholars in the 20th century have been critical about xin da ya. Now, why? What's wrong with xin da ya? I'll talk about that. I'll also talk about misinterpretations of xin da ya. Okay, not all scholars agree what xin means, what da means, what ya means. What are their interpretations? Are they the same as what Yanfu intended? That would be the second part. In the third part, I want to provide my own reinterpretation of xin da ya. My definition of xin da ya, I think you'll find out later, is a little bit different from what you guys have told me a little bit earlier. And what I'd like to do is view xin da ya through the lens of, oh, that's a typo there, through the lens of modern communication theory, and then talk about the implications for translation theory itself. And in the very end, I want to apply Yanfu's principles to his own writing. Did Yanfu himself achieve xin da ya? And in some ways, I think we can use Yanfu as a cautionary tale. Okay, so let's begin with the background. Now, Yanfu the person. Yanfu was born to a educated family, so his parents sent him to a pretty good school. Okay, I should begin with this. Yanfu is known as the father of modern Chinese translation studies because of what he has written on xin da ya and also because of the things he has translated. He lived between the end of the Qing dynasty and the beginning of the Republican era. So 1854 to 1921, he kind of straddled 2 periods, the imperial period and also the modern period. And this is going to be important because some of the ideas that he had to do with this skip from one period to the next. Okay, so he attended the Fuzhou Naval Academy. That is one of the few academies in China at the time that taught foreign languages. He was sent there because he came from an educated family who believed in education. Now, because he studied foreign languages, after studying at the Fuzhou Naval Academy, he was sent to England. He went to study at the Royal Naval Academy in Greenwich, England, and that allowed him to study a lot of Western works. That also gave him proficiency in English and the ability to translate from English into Chinese. So after he returned, he translated a lot of key Western works into the Chinese language. These included Huxley's Evolution and Ethics, Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, John Stuart Mill on Liberty, and Montesquieu, The Spirit of the Laws, to mention a few. Okay, so he was known as a translator in his time. Now, probably more influential than his translations was what appeared in the preface to one of his translations, and that is this theory of xin da ya. Chinese translation scholars in the 20th century placed a lot of emphasis on these three. Okay, Shan 1995 calls it the fundamental tenets of 20th century translation theory. Other scholars have called it the golden rule of translation, or the most influential theory of Chinese translation in the modern era. So this is what we're going to be focusing on today, Yanfu's xin da ya. Now, xin da ya first appeared in the notes on translation that came at the beginning of Huxley's Evolution and Ethics. So he translated Evolution and Ethics, but at the very beginning of this book, he had this preface called Notes on Translation, and xin da ya basically first appeared in here. So let's look at what he wrote. Okay, xin da ya this preface isn't very long. I've divided it into 7 parts. The first 3 parts are more important for our understanding of these terms. Parts 4 to 7 are less important. So let's go through each of these parts one by one. We'll begin with the main thesis, And then in part 2, he'll talk about sentence structures. In part 3, he'll talk about the use of the classical language. Part 4, neologisms. Part 5, historical background. Part 6, notes and comparisons. And part 7, his justification for publishing. I think a lot of people talk about Xindaya without actually reading Yanfu, and we don't want to do that. So we want to first read what Yanfu actually wrote, and then start thinking about whether Xindaya makes sense. Okay, part 1, his main thesis. Most people who know about Xindaya know these lines. The first is 易事三难, Xindaya. In translation, there are 3 things that are difficult. Which 3 things? Xin, Da, and Ya. And then a second comment is, it's very hard to achieve Xin. But if you don't achieve Da, or if you achieve Xin but don't achieve Da, then there's no point in translating at all. Okay, this is his opening statement. So what has he said? He told us that there are 3 challenges in translation, Xin, Da, Ya, but he gave no definition. So it is assumed that you should know what he means by Xin, Da, Ya. And then he goes on to say that Xin is difficult, but perhaps Da is even more important. Because if you have Xin, but you don't have Da, then translation itself is not worthwhile. Okay, think about what this means. Okay, the second part, the second part of the first part. Okay, he basically says that there are a lot of translators out there, but their translations are not perfect. These are some problems. And then he also says that when he translates, what he's translation in evolution and ethics is basically scientific theories, which are kind of difficult to understand. So when he's translating, he's not going to translate word for word, but he's going to move things around a bit. He might shorten or lengthen things. He might use some flexibility, and he says that's so that people can understand. But then he goes on to say that that's probably not the best thing to do. Okay, let's look at our summary. He says that there are a lot of translators around, but they're mostly guilty of these 3 things. The first is that they don't understand the original deeply enough. The second is that their understanding is partial, not thorough. And number 3, 辨知者少 can be interpreted in a number of ways. You could say that they don't pay enough attention to detail, or you could also say that they're not aware of their shortcomings. But either way, most translators in his time do not do a good enough job, and these are the reasons. Okay, then he goes on to say how he himself translates. He says that he basically translates the underlying meaning, and he takes liberties. He freely adds and deletes. Why does he do that? Because he wants to communicate the idea to his readers. And he says that by adding and deleting, he's probably not a very good influence. So if you're a translator, don't do what he's doing. Okay, in part 2, he talks about the differences in sentence structure between English and Chinese. The main idea is that sentences in English can be a lot longer and more complex than what is acceptable in Chinese. So he's saying that in English you have these very long sentences where when you come across an unfamiliar term, it's possible to give a definition right there within the sentence. And when you're done with the definition, you continue on with the sentence. However, when you're translating it into Chinese, you can't do that because the Chinese sentence becomes too long and it's hard for readers to understand. Okay, so he says, European sentences are sometimes very long. Chinese sentences tend to be shorter. European sentences contain relative clauses, clauses embedded within clauses. Chinese sentences tend not to allow that. Okay, and if you were to translate literally from English into Chinese or European languages into Chinese, then the Chinese sentence would seem unnatural, and when it's unnatural, the meaning will be lost. Okay, so then what does he do? He says the idea is to understand the whole thing, okay, without trying to map word for word from English into Chinese. First, as a translator, understand the entire idea. And then second, without looking, say the whole thing in your own words. And then after you've done that, if you've missed anything, add to it or take things away. Okay, so he says, first read and understand the source text in its entirety. Then go on to render the spirit of the original into fluent natural Chinese. If anything is lost, add explanations before and after. And if you're able to do that, then it achieves the second goal, which is Da. And if you achieve Da, you automatically achieve Xin. Okay, so here you have a relationship between Da and Xin. He basically says if you have Da, then you have Xin. Do people agree? Is there anybody who thinks differently? Are Xin and Da independent? Or is Xin dependent on Da? Okay, I'll leave you to think about that. maybe at the end you can tell me what you think. Okay, so this is part 2, which touches upon the relationship between da and xin. And then we go on to part 3. Part 3 begins with 3 quotes from Chinese classics. Okay, the first quote is from the I Ching, the Book of Changes, and that quote is 修辞立成. The next 2 quotes are from the Analects of Confucius. The second quote is 词达而已矣. And the third quote, also from Confucius, is 言之无问，行之不远. Okay, and he goes on to say that these 3 ideas are kind of the hallmarks of good writing, and they should also be the hallmarks of good translation. Okay, let's look in a little more detail what these quotes mean. All right, so first the justification for 信 comes from the I Ching, 修辞立成, which can be roughly translated as language should be true to your intentions. Okay, 修辞立成, that's the justification for the first 信. The justification for the second part, 达, is Confucius's saying, 词达而已矣. The point of language is to get your message across. So the message needs to get across. That's the second justification. And the third justification for 雅 is 言之无问，行之不远. Okay, so if you don't use standard language, then your message is not going to travel very far. Okay, that's the third part. 3 quotes from classics. And then he goes on to say, notice that in part 3, in addition to 信 and 达, he introduces a third criteria, and that is 雅. This is where the third criteria, 雅, first appears. So he says, in addition to 信 and 达, we also want to introduce 雅, not only because it can allow your translation to travel far, but also because that kind of language can explain more. Okay, let me go into the summary. So standard language travels farther than, say, localisms or regional slang. That's one reason. But also another reason is because standard language is more precise and it's better for describing scientific concepts. When you use colloquial language, well, everyday colloquial language might not be capable of describing these abstract concepts. Okay, and then the rest is less important, so I'm just going to go straight to the summary. He says that he's been criticized for choosing literary language, classical Chinese, which was a standard at his time. Okay, some people say it makes it hard to read. Some people think that he's just showing off. But he says that's not it. He says, I'm translating into literary Chinese because it's more precise and because this is the language that educated people all around China can understand. Okay, and then we go on to sections 4, 5, 6, and 7. These are less important, so let's just look at the gist of it. Okay, his translation is basically a translation of scientific essays. So he says that it's going to include a lot of scientific terminology that have no equivalents in Chinese. So what do you do with these scientific terms? He says he thought very hard about how to translate them, and he came up with his own translations. He gives examples, but that is not important here. He says whether or not they're good translations, he'll leave it to future generations to decide. He also explains that a lot of these scientific concepts trace all the way back to ancient Greece. If you live in the West, you're probably familiar with these concepts. If you live in the East, in China, you're probably not. So he's added a section that gives you the background of Western science. Okay, section 6, notes and comparisons. He says translation is like politics. You kind of have to know what other people are doing in order to do a good job. So he has a section where he explains how his practices are different from those of other people. And then the last part, he explains that before he published this translation, he taught it at a university, at an academy, and his students gave him feedback. Other people also gave him feedback and encouraged him to publish it, which is why he chose to publish it in the end. Okay, and that is everything. That is Yan Fu's notes on translation, from which we get 信达雅. Okay, if we look back at it, he doesn't really say that much about 信达雅, right? A lot of it is digressions, and a lot of it he basically rambles on about other things. The main parts where he talks about 信达雅 are in part 1, in the very beginning. He says there are 3 things that are hard in translation. These are 信达雅, without giving definitions. And then he goes on to talk about the relationship between 信 and 达. He says 信 is important, but if you don't achieve 达, then it kind of cancels the whole thing. Okay, without 达, you basically don't have 信, and it's not worth translating. And then he goes on to say how, I guess I didn't explain this part very carefully, But there was a part where he says when he's translating, he kind of switches things around. He makes some things shorter, some things longer. He takes liberties. And the whole purpose of this is to achieve da. So again, showing that da is important. And when he says when you achieve da, you also automatically achieve xin. And then the last part that is important is he says in addition to xin and da, you also have ya. Why do you need ya? 2 reasons. Number 1, because when you translate into a standard language or literary language, then it travels far. More people can understand it. That's number 1. Number 2, when you want to explain abstract or difficult concepts, standard language is more equipped, better equipped to explain these concepts, whereas colloquial slang and localisms are not. Okay, and that is pretty much more or less what he has said about xin da ya. Now, because he didn't say a lot, and more importantly, because he didn't actually define the 3 terms, people don't really agree as to what xin da ya mean. And different people have defined xin da ya in different ways. So let's look at some examples. So for example, Shen Suru in 1998 defined xin as 忠于原著, which I think is the same as how a lot of you defined it, loyal to the original work, that is xin. Da is 一笔明达, output is clear and fluent. And then ya is 文字水平高, a high level of sophistication in language. Okay, this is Shen Suru, 1998. Okay, Xu, 1973, calls xin faithfulness, da, comprehensibility, ya, elegance. Chan, 1995, xin is fidelity, da is fluency, and ya is elegance. And there are other people that define ya differently, like Womoro, for example, defines ya as literary or artistic value. Now, when you think about it, there are differences in all of these interpretations. First, let's take xin. Xin is loyalty or faithfulness of some sort, right? But here the question we need to ask is, do we need to be faithful to the text, or do we need to be faithful to the author? Sometimes these two are different things, right? Sometimes the author says one thing, but the text can be interpreted in a different way. So do you go with the author's intention, or do you go with the text itself? And different people have different views. Now, da, as you can see, can be interpreted in at least 2 ways. Some people say it's fluent. Some people say it's comprehensible. When you think about it, fluent isn't necessarily the same as comprehensible. You can have language that's very fluent, but that's hard to understand. Or you can have language that's easy to understand, but it's not fluent. So is da fluent, or is it comprehensible? And then ya, you also have a range of different interpretations. A lot of people call it elegance, so your translation has to be elegant. Whereas other people say you should look at the artistic or literary value. Okay, and Yanfu himself, as you saw earlier, doesn't really treat it as elegance or artistic value, but translating into the literary language. So there's some variation there as well. Now, because no clear definition was given in the original text, people felt that they're able to interpret it in different ways. Now, I've actually given a talk here on xin da ya, I think, I don't know how many years ago. But I'm talking about this again because my views have changed since then. Back then, my view of xin da ya wasn't that positive. I thought it was very problematic in a lot of ways. Okay, these were my views back then. I believe that if xin da ya was to be a valid theory of translation, then you need to show that xin da ya are independent dimensions. Either show that they're independent or show what their codependence relationship is. And I don't think that was made clear by Yanfu. Second, another way to look at it is if you have xin da ya as 3 independent dimensions, then you need to prove the necessity of xin da ya. You need to prove the sufficiency of xin da ya. You need to prove the dimensional independence of the 3. And you also need to demonstrate what happens if we have xin, but not da and ya. What if we have xin and da, but no ya? What about da without xin and ya? Can we have da and ya without xin? How about ya without xin and da? Or xin and ya without da? We need to look at all of these possible combinations in order to prove that xin, da, and ya are the 3 dimensions that we need. Okay, so these were my views back then. And these views were based on a more traditional interpretation of 信达雅. Now, because 信达雅 has been interpreted in all sorts of different ways, ways in which Yanfu probably did not intend, there are problems that have led to criticisms. Now, the misinterpretations that we see mostly have to do with the fact that Yanfu was writing in literary Chinese, whereas these later people were interpreting the terms through modern Chinese. So the modern Chinese understanding of the terms is different from the literary Chinese interpretation of the term. It's kind of like if we were to look at a foreign language sentence that has cognates with English, let's say German or Spanish. Now, having cognates doesn't mean that these words would mean the same thing. Do we have any German speakers here? So we have a Dutch speaker, right, which is similar. So if you look at the sentence as an English speaker, wird der Chef das Gift ins Gymnasium bringen, it looks a lot like, will the chef bring the gift to the gymnasium, right? In fact, this is not chef at all in German. This is more like chief, which is the boss, okay? Gift is not a present in German. Gift is poison. And then gymnasium isn't like a sports gym. It's like a grammar school. So the sentence actually means, will the boss bring the poison to the grammar school? But if you understand it through English, then you're going to get it all wrong because you think these words mean what they mean in English. Okay, any Spanish speakers here? Okay, so let me know if I get this wrong. If I were to read, vomito en su dormitorio, no en la librería, to an English speaker, it might read something like, vomit in the dormitory, don't vomit in the library. But then in Spanish, dormitorio is bedroom, right? And libreria is actually bookstore. So it's about a bookstore and a bedroom rather than a dormitory and a library. So when you interpret it in a different language, you run into problems like these. And that is exactly what is happening when we're interpreting 严复信达雅 with modern Chinese. Okay, so let's look at some criticisms of 信达雅, beginning with 赵元任, 1969. Okay, this is a criticism of Da. Okay, Da, as you'll remember, is either fluency or comprehensibility. Okay, so Zhao Yuanren says, sometimes you want comprehensibility. Let's say you have a patient who can't speak clearly, and you want to interpret for this patient so that the doctor can understand him. Then, of course, you want to be able to have an output that is comprehensible for the doctor. So that would be a plus for Da. However, let's say you have a novel, a literary work, where you have certain characters who cannot speak properly. They have dyslexia or some other problem that causes their speech to be disfluent. In your translation, do you make their speech fluent or do you keep it disfluent? Now, in order to keep the storyline, you would want to keep that speech disfluent, right? So changing the speech from disfluent to fluent isn't necessarily a good thing in all situations. Okay, this is Zhao Yuanren. And Chang Xiefeng in 1981 says pretty much the same thing. In works of art, sometimes the artist or the author intentionally wants the language to be disfluent. And if that's the case, you should keep it disfluent. So if the original is disfluent, then make it disfluent. If the original is fluent, then make it fluent. You don't want to make it fluent in all situations. Okay. If you were to change something that is disfluent to something that is fluent, when disfluency is what is intended, then you're basically not being faithful to the original. Okay, this is a criticism against Da. Okay, let's look at some criticisms against Ya. And notice that when they're criticizing Ya, they're pretty much treating Ya as elegance, which is not what Yanfu intended. Okay, so Zhao Yuanren gives this example. Let's say you're a court interpreter, okay, and then you're interpreting for a defamation lawsuit where one person says, this person insulted me. He said to me, you're a damn fool. Okay, so that's why I want to sue him. Now, if I were to translate you're a damn fool into something really elegant, then that kind of defeats the purpose of the lawsuit, right? There's nothing to sue for. So in this case, you're not supposed to make it more elegant. So elegance is not something that is desirable in this sort of translation. And Chang Xiefeng basically says the same thing that he said for Da. If the original is elegant, make it elegant. If the original is inelegant, then translate it into something inelegant. If you don't do that, If you make something that's inelegant into something that's elegant, then you're not producing a very faithful translation. Okay, so these are some criticisms against da and ya. Now, in the next part, I want to turn the whole thing around. I want to say that xin da ya don't mean these things at all. And if we don't interpret xin da ya in that way, then basically all the criticisms are moot. So how are we supposed to interpret xin da ya? Okay, let me see how much I can do in this part, and then we'll have a little break at about 2:15, and then I'll continue. Now, one thing we need to look at, or let me try it in a different way. One of the problems with Yan Fu's notes on translation is that he did not define the terms xin da ya. He mentioned them, he gave examples, he gave comments, but he didn't actually give a definition, right? Or did he? Okay, some people believe he didn't. I certainly believed he didn't define them when I first read the piece, but now I believe he did. Okay, where did he define them? Remember those 3 quotes from the Chinese classics? I now believe that those are the definitions. When you think about it, people in ancient times didn't really write in the way that we do now. When we're writing a paper or a thesis, we like to give a detailed definition before we start using these terms. In ancient times, that wasn't the custom. The custom was to quote somebody else, to quote an authority, and use the authority of that source to boost your own argument. So Yan Fu wasn't giving his own definition. Rather, he wanted to quote from Confucius. He wanted to quote from the Book of Changes to support what he was trying to say. That was the practice back then. That's not the practice now. So a lot of people misunderstood this. Okay, a lot of modern scholars believe that those classic quotes are irrelevant. For example, Cheng in 2016 writes, 言复断章取义，引文不伦不类之感。古人属文引经断章取义，由来已久。 So he basically says that he's just taking these classics out of context. It makes no sense at all, but that's to be understood because that's what the ancients did. They always take things out of context and write things that make no sense. Okay, so that is kind of a modern view, but I would beg to differ. Okay, so how are these 3 quotes definitions? Let's look at them. Let's look at the quote about xin. Let's look at the quote about da. And let's look at the quote about ya. Beginning with the quote from the I Ching that supports xin. Okay, the quote from the I Ching reads like this. The I Ching says, 修辞立诚. Now, if you were to interpret cheng in modern Chinese, most people think of 诚实, which means honest. Okay, so there's something about being honest or sincere that's important for translation. But think about it some more, and it doesn't make much sense. Honesty has to do with a person, right? Whereas when you're translating, you're doing something to the text. What does being honest or not have to do with how I translate? If I'm dishonest, does it mean that I can't produce a good translation? If I'm honest, is my translation automatically good? So, people have noticed this. The scholar Zhuo Jiazhen writes, 信指的应该是译者的人格. This is a personality issue, a character issue. It has nothing to do with translation. Okay, Cheng also writes, 修辞立诚, 诚, 重点在于人的态度. Sincerity is about a person's attitude. 信, faithfulness is about whether you've been loyal to the original text. Okay, there's no strong relation between the two. Whether you're an honest person or if you're being faithful to the original text. These two are not related. And if you really wanted to link them, well, you're going to have to do some semantic gymnastics, like this person does here. He says, okay, 信 is honest, right? If you're honest, then it means you're not deceiving the reader, and you're not deceiving the author. If you're not deceiving the author and you're not deceiving the reader, then that means that you're being faithful to the original text. Maybe it makes sense, maybe it doesn't, but it definitely is a leap. If you want to go from sincerity or honesty to fidelity, then you're going to have to make this leap. Now, I would argue that 诚 does not mean sincere or honest at all. Okay, the problem here is that 诚 in modern Chinese is an adjective, whereas 诚 back then, I believe, should be a noun. Okay. A lot of these four-character expressions have a symmetrical structure. So this quote has the structure 修辞立成. 修 is a verb, 辞 is a noun. Okay, so 修辞 is to craft your words. 立 is to establish, and then 成 is what we're trying to define. To establish is a verb, so this 成 should be a noun. So what is it that we're trying to establish? I believe that the 成 here doesn't mean sincerity, it means your innermost thoughts, your intentions. Okay, in this way, this 成 is a lot like the notion of 中 that we see in the 中庸. I can't remember if I have a slide on this. Let me see. Yeah, I do. Okay. So let me digress a little bit and talk about this 中 and then use the same idea on 成. Most of you, I think, have heard of 中庸or 中庸之道. And the modern understanding of 中庸, I don't think is what 中庸meant back in Confucius's day, but it is what 中庸meant from the Song dynasty onwards, thanks to the scholar Zhu Xi. When most people think of 中庸, they think of the middle, okay? Not too extreme, not too much to the left, not too much to the right, somewhere in the middle, that is 中, that is 中庸. That is conceiving of 中 or middle in a one-dimensional sense. If you think of a line, the middle of that line is 中. Okay, that's the Song dynasty interpretation. But when you go back to the original work, 中 is actually conceived in a three-dimensional way. Imagine a sphere. Imagine something like the earth. The core of the earth is the 中. Okay, it's what's hidden inside that hasn't been exposed to the outside yet. So the 中庸actually says, 喜怒哀乐之未发，谓之中. The emotions that you have inside that you haven't expressed yet, that is 中. And I believe that is also the meaning of 诚. Now, how does that square? So 修辞立成. 修辞 is to produce words, right? What is the purpose of producing these words? It is to express your intentions that are inside. So you begin with ideas or intentions that are inside of you, and how do you let other people know? Well, you turn them into words. Okay, so you write words with the intention of expressing your intentions. Okay, that is how I would reinterpret 修辞立成. And if we interpret it in this way, then what Yan Fu is actually saying isn't so much that you should be faithful to the original text, but rather, in translation, what you need to determine is what the author's intentions are. Okay, the starting point is what the author intended rather than what is written on the text. That is how I would reinterpret this 信 or 诚. Next, let's look at 答. Okay, the second element, 信达雅, 答. If you look at the quote that is given by Yan Fu is from Confucius. Confucius says, 辞达而已矣. Okay, so what's the point of language or words? It's kind of to get your message across. Now, what does 答 mean? If you look at modern Chinese translations of the Analects and English translations of the Analects, the interpretations are actually quite different. I would say that the English translations are right. The modern Chinese translations are not that correct. Let's look at the Chinese ones. Okay, so 辞达而已矣. Okay, what does the 答 mean? Li Ling, this is a very famous Confucian scholar. He says, 答是表达的意思. 答 is to express. 把想说的意思说清楚，写明白. So basically, explain things clearly. It's to do with clarity. Okay, another scholar, Wu Hongyi, says, 答这个字，说话作文要明白通畅. So be clear, be fluent. That is 答. Now, I would argue differently. I believe that 答 means to reach a goal or to reach a destination. Okay. And when you think of reaching a destination, from the point of view of cognitive linguistics, you can't talk about a destination without including the schema of travel. So source, path, goal. You have a starting point, you have a path that you travel along, and then you get to this destination. So this schema is part of the definition of goal, and that is the meaning of 答. to reach whatever goal you are trying to reach. And this is the use of da that you see more commonly in classical texts. Let me give you 2 examples. In Buddhist texts, for example, you often see stuff like 教化众生皆令就近达彼岸. You're all familiar with the concept of 达彼岸, right? To reach the other shore. Now, the da here doesn't mean to be fluent. It means to reach that destination. And then this is a text coming from around the period of Confucius. He's talking about the relationship between China and the other ethnicities in the periphery. He says, all these other ethnicities, 我诸戎, 饮食衣不与华同. Their food, their clothing are not the same as the Chinese. 制币不同. Their currency is different. 言语不达. Okay, and something about their language not being da. Here it's not about their language not being fluent. It's about not being able to communicate with your language. If you say something in Chinese, it's not going to get through to them. If they say something in their language, it's not going to get through to the Chinese. Okay, so da would say, I would say, has this meaning of reaching or getting the point across. And this is, when you look at English translations of the Analects, I think they get this point very well. Okay, Ames and Rosemont. When expressing oneself, it is simply a matter of getting the point across. Or Brooks and Brooks. Words should reach their goal. And that is exactly what we mean by da. Okay, so up to this point, we've looked at Yan Fu's original text, right? You now know what Yan Fu actually wrote. I also gave you how Xin Da Ya has been traditionally interpreted and how it's been misunderstood and how these misunderstandings have led to criticisms. And then I mentioned that I want to reinterpret Xin Da Ya. I want to reinterpret Xin Da Ya based on these classical quotes. I've given you 2 of my reinterpretations, a reinterpretation of Xin, which is the author's intentions, and a reinterpretation of Da, which is to reach the goal or to reach the audience. I haven't yet given you my interpretation of Ya. Let's do that in the second half. We can maybe take a short break here and then come back and talk about Ya. Okay, thank you. Okay, so it looks like everybody is back. Let's continue. In the first hour, we were talking about Xin Da Ya, and we were reinterpreting the term Xin Da Ya using the 3 quotes, classical quotes that Yan Fu gave in part 3 of his notes to translation. And in the reinterpretation, we said that xin is supposed to mean the intention of the author. Da is about reaching the audience. Let's now look at ya. What is ya supposed to mean? Now, regarding the meaning of ya, Yan Fu actually makes this quite clear in his text, but a lot of people have chosen to ignore his comments. A lot of people interpret ya as elegance or sophistication, when Yan, in his Yi Li Yan, says that it's supposed to mean 用汉以前字法句法. Okay, he wants to use the lexicon and the syntax of the Chinese language before the Han Dynasty, from the pre-Han period. What he's basically saying is, when you're translating, translate into classical Chinese, literary Chinese. Don't translate into Baihua. Don't translate into spoken Chinese. Now, to understand why that is, we have to understand a little bit about the period that Yan Fu was living in. Yan Fu was living in the Qing Dynasty in the first part of his life. Okay, and that was a period when people were still writing in literary Chinese. That is probably a little hard for us to understand now, because whether you speak English or Chinese, you're living in a society where you write as you speak. The writing that you write is more or less the same as the speech that you speak. But for a lot of societies in earlier times, that wasn't the case at all. For example, in medieval Europe, if you wanted to write anything scholarly, you had to write in Latin. You may be speaking English or French or German, but any formal writing was done in Latin. And prior to the 1920s in China, if you wanted to write anything formal, you had to write in classical Chinese. You cannot write in the vernacular speech that you speak. Okay, so that was the environment Yan Fu was born into, which is why he makes this comment here. The third principle, ya, is when you translate, you should translate into the classical language. And the reasons for that we explained earlier. It reaches further, more people can understand it, and second, it's more capable of explaining abstract concepts. Okay, that is the meaning of ya. Now, what relevance does it have for us now? We don't write in literary Chinese anymore, right? So should we still apply Yanfu's principle of ya? I believe that we can look at this principle in another way. What Yanfu is basically saying is that when you translate, you should translate into the standard language of the time. Okay, even with Chinese or English, you have standard written English, standard written Chinese, versus stuff that is more slangy or stuff that is full of jargon. Okay, you don't want to use that. You want to use something that the majority of people can understand. And that, I believe, is the essence of ya. Translate into the standard language. That way you can maximize your reach. You can broaden your audience. Okay, so that would be my new interpretation of xin, da, ya. Xin is the author's intent, da is reaching your audience, and ya is writing in the standard language so that you can maximize your reception, your audience. And if we look at xin, da, ya in this way, it actually fits in quite well with a lot of modern theories of communication. Basically, what we've outlined in xin, da, ya is what communication is all about. And to illustrate this, I want to compare xin, da, ya with a model of communication that is designed by Harold Laswell. Okay, keep in mind that xin, da, ya is a one-way model of translation, communication. So we're going from the author to the reader and not the other way around, so there isn't a feedback loop. It is also a linear model, so we basically go in a straight line. And when it comes to ya, when you want to reach a maximum audience, you can argue that it's a model of broadcast communication. You're going from one source to a lot of different receivers. Okay, so looked at in this way, it matches quite well with Laswell's graphic model of communication. Laswell's model works something like this. You begin with a who is doing the communication, and what his intent is. In order to communicate, this person has to say something. Okay, who says what? So you go from the communicator to the message. And once you have the message, you have to think about what the medium is. Okay, what does the message go through to reach the audience? Through which channel? And then we have to decide who is the audience. Who are we trying to send the message to? To whom? Who's the receiver? And finally, once the message is received, does it have the intended effect on the receiver? With what effect? What the effect is. Communicator, message, medium, receiver, and effect. Now, how do we fit xin, da, ya into this? Let's take a look. Okay. Now, xin has to do with who and says what. When you go from what the communicator intended to what he actually says, this part is what xin covers. Xin says, your message has to truly reflect what your intention is. This part is xin. Da has to do with whether the message achieved its intended effect. Okay, so you have a message, it reaches the audience. Does it have the effect that you want it to have? That is da. And ya has to do with the medium. Okay, so what language are you translating it into? And when you translate into this language, who can it reach? Okay, so through what channel and reaching who, this part is ya. So you can fit xin, da, ya right into Laswell's 1948 model. It begins with xin, it ends with da, and then ya accounts for the two middle steps. So looked at in this way, you could say that xin is all about encoding your message. When you have an idea and you want to express it, are you expressing it effectively? Can people who see the message know what your intention is? This is the xin part. Da is about the decoding. Once the message is received, does it have the intended effect on the receivers or the audience? That is the decoding, that's the da. And then ya is to do with the medium that you're sending the message through. What language are you sending it through? Which recipients can this language reach? That would be the ya part. It's all to do with encoding, decoding, and the medium that is chosen. So looked at in this way, what does this new model of xin, da, ya teach us? The first is that xin is about prioritizing speaker intention. It's not about the text itself, but it's about what the speaker wants to express through this text. So Yanfu basically believes that we should look to the author to what he is trying to express. Da is about dominant hegemonic readings. Okay. We want the recipients to have the meaning that the speaker intends. So we hope that there isn't a misinterpretation or a reinterpretation. And then Ya is all about maximizing audience reach. Okay, this is kind of an extra linguistic consideration that we'll talk about a little bit later. Okay, let's look at some examples. What practical examples does this have? And some of these examples I have given before, so if you've heard it before, bear with me. First, let's apply it to the law. Let's apply it to the field of statutory interpretation. Okay, the Supreme Court has been in the news a lot recently, right? A lot of it has to do with how they interpret laws. And there are different ways to interpret laws that were written in the past. You can focus on the text, or you can focus on the intent of the framers. So you could say that one approach is to take the spirit over the letter, that is focusing on legislative intent, which is kind of like what we want to do in Xin. The other is to focus on the text itself, and that is textualism, emphasizing the letter over the spirit. And when you're emphasizing the letter, you can focus on either the plain meaning or the original public meaning. We'll look at that later. But legislative intent, okay, how does that affect interpretation? Let's look at an example. Okay, let me skip this. The example that I want to give is that of the Americans with Disabilities Act passed in 1990. Okay, 1990 is before the advent of the internet, right? The internet sort of came out just before the 2000s or so. Okay, but this act basically says that disabled Americans must have equal access to places of public accommodation, and if they don't, then they can be sued for it. Okay, so there was a lawsuit that came up because of this. The lawsuit was brought about by some visually impaired people who were suing Target the store. Why were they suing Target? Because they said that Target's website did not make the information accessible to people who were visually impaired. So if you're blind, say, you can't access Target's website. And that violates the Americans with Disabilities Act. Or does it? The Americans with Disabilities Act says people must have equal access to places of public accommodation. Is a website a place? Is it a place of public accommodation? That is kind of debatable, right? Some people would argue that a website is not an actual place, and therefore this act does not apply. But if you focus on the intent rather than the text, then you could argue that when this act was set up in 1990, the people who framed it probably intended for people with disabilities to access websites as well. And if that was the intent, then this act does apply. And I believe that was the reading in the end. So this is a reading that is focused on the intent rather than the actual text, which squares with our definition of xin. Another example, my second example comes from the field of literature. Okay, when it comes to interpretations of literary texts, if a text can be interpreted in different ways, then we can ask, are we going to go with the author's interpretation? Okay, this approach is similar to biographical criticism or social historical criticism. Or are we just going to focus on the text itself? We don't care what the author says. That would be a textual approach, such as structuralism. Or do we believe that the reader can freely interpret the text according to the reader's own experiences? And if we take that approach, that would be the approach of reader response. According to our understanding of xin, we believe that Yanfu believes in biographical criticism. Yanfu believes that when interpreting a text, we should take into account the author's intentions. And how do we know what the author's thinking? We have to take into account the author's biography and the historical period that the author is born into. I'll give you an example. Some people might be familiar with this poem. It's called the Qi Bu Shi in Chinese. Who has heard of it? Qi Bu Shi. Okay, you in the back, tell us about it. What's the story behind the Qi Bu Shi and what does it mean?
It's an ancient poem about one of Cao Cao's sons.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's probably about two brothers.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them is about to maybe do harm to the other. I don't remember the context exactly.
Uh-huh.
So the other one it's trying to get him out of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
His condition was to compose a poem
Mm-hmm.
within 7 steps of time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what he did.
Within taking his 7 steps, he composes his poem essentially saying that you and I are from the same family, the same roots. Why do you pursue me so harshly? Yeah, so try to reflect the brotherly compassion through that expression.
Terrific. Thank you for giving us such a wonderful explanation. Let's look at the 七步诗 itself. Okay, the poem itself says this. Beans a simmer on a beanstalk flame. From inside the pot express their ire. The Chinese actually says sob, but to rhyme, they made it into ire. Alive we sprouted on a single root. What's your rush to cook us on the fire? So the idea is this. You have the beans that are cooking in the pot, right? And the stems, the beanstalk, are used to build the fire. So you have the stems burning so that they can cook the beans in the pot. And on the surface, it's just a poem about cooking beans, right? Not that interesting. But when you take into account the author's background, then it becomes more interesting. Okay, I think she mentioned earlier that the person who wrote this poem was Cao Zhi. Cao Zhi was brother to Cao Pei, and the two are sons of the emperor Cao Cao. Okay, Cao Cao was emperor at the time, and then his position was to be passed on to the older son, Cao Pei. But the more talented son was the younger son, Cao Zhi. He was actually a very talented poet, so Cao Pei was jealous. Okay, like a lot of siblings born into imperial families, they're always worried that one of your siblings is going to rob you of your rightful position. So you want to kill them or send them away or do something terrible to them, and that is what Cao Pei was thinking. So Cao Pei in a way was jealous of Cao Zhi, especially since he was a good poet. So there came the time when Cao Pei said to Cao Zhi, so you're a great poet, right? Let's see if you can do this for me. I want you to take 7 steps, and by the time you reach your 7th step, you need to have completed a poem. Write me a poem in 7 steps. So Cao Zhi wrote this poem, basically about beans that were being cooked. The beans and the beanstalks came from the same root. This is a metaphor for Cao Pei and himself. They were brothers. So why is it that you're trying to burn me? He's basically saying that. Okay, when you take into account the biographical background, then the poem makes a lot more sense. When you don't, then it loses a lot of meaning. Okay, this is Xin emphasizing the author's intent. Okay, let's look at Da. Okay, what we understand of Da is reaching the audience, and Yan Fu seems to emphasize in the Yi Li Yan that Da trumps all. Comprehensibility trumps all. Even if you're very loyal to the original, if nobody can understand it, then what's the point? So it seems that comprehensibility is very important. And then finally, Ya. Ya is the choice of a standard language as your medium. Okay, and you could say that there are 2 aspects to this. There's an extra-linguistic aspect and there's an intra-linguistic aspect. From the extra-linguistic aspect, the question asked is, what language do you translate into? Very often that's not the translator's choice. On the one hand, the translator usually doesn't know that many languages, so he doesn't get to choose whether I want to translate into English or Finnish or Swedish. Okay, you translate into what language you know, and often it's to do with what other people want you to translate into. Okay, so you don't choose on your own what language to translate into. So this is beyond your ability. But you do have an intralinguistic choice, which is, let's say you're translating into Chinese, you could choose which kind of Chinese. Do I want to make it more formal or more informal? Do I want to make it more like the Chinese used in mainland China or Hong Kong or Taiwan? There are all these different varieties that I could choose. The same goes for translating into English. Do I want to use British expressions or American expressions? Okay. And in this regard, Yan Fu is basically telling us that we should choose to translate into the variety that's the most widely accepted. Now, is that the way things are done now? Not exactly. Nowadays, if you look at things like software translation, often what we see is localization processes. So Microsoft Windows, if you want to translate into Chinese, well, you have different versions for different regions. There's Chinese mainland, Chinese Singapore, Chinese Taiwan, Chinese Hong Kong, etc. You produce all of these different variants. But back in Yan Fu's day, he didn't have these choices. So he basically said to translate into the most widely acceptable version. Okay, so at the very end, let's look at Yan Fu's historical legacy. First, Yan straddled the Qing dynasty and the Republican period. He lived in a period when the standard written language changed from the literate Chinese that he was familiar with into the modern colloquial Chinese that we use now. Okay, so the language, the written language, literally changed overnight in his lifetime. And that is not something that you come across very often, but that is something that you need to be aware of. The European Bible translators were very aware of this. So when they were translating their Bible, they translated it into all kinds of different versions. They translated it into literary Chinese, so you see a lot of Wenli versions, but they also translated the Bible into different colloquial versions. They didn't know which colloquial language, vernacular language was going to win out, so you have Bibles in Nanjing Mandarin, Bibles in Beijing Mandarin, and lots of other dialects. You could say that the European missionaries hedged their bets. Yanfu didn't. Yanfu was adamant that literary Chinese was going to win out. So he said that you should translate into literary Chinese only. And he was later proved wrong. And what's the price of betting on the wrong thing? Does anybody read Yanfu's translations now? Has any of you ever read Yanfu's 天演论 or any of his other translations of European authors? Probably not, right? Even if you did, you probably wouldn't understand it. It's probably easier to read it in the original English than to try to read it in Yanfu's literary Chinese. Because he made the wrong bet, nobody reads his translations now. And because he made the wrong bet, people even misunderstood his ideas. People thought that he did not define 信达雅. People did not understand what he meant by 信 and what he meant by 达 and 雅. These are all consequences of making the wrong bet. So, some lessons for us. I know a lot of you are doing translations. When you're doing translations, you need to translate with a view to the future, not just with a view to the present. Ask yourself, will your translation still be relevant 20 years from now? What about 50 years or 100 years from now? Are they still going to be relevant to future readers? And will new technologies be able to do the same work better and faster? If AI, say, were to do a lot of the translations that you're doing now, would they still read your translations, or would they just get AI to retranslate everything? You also want to future-proof your work. Okay. When you look at your translations, are there things in your translations that date it? If you look at Yanfu's translation, the fact that he translated into literary Chinese automatically dates it, automatically makes it something that people don't want to read, right? What features of your translations will make it unpalatable to future readers? Okay, so these are things I think that you can think about, lessons that we can take from Yanfu. And speaking of things in the future, I'll be coming back on Thursday to talk about AI and how that may be transforming what you do and the work that I do. Okay, with that, I'll end my talk and see if people have any questions. Thank you.